So now let's cover paraphrasing. Paraphrasing can be tricky, and students tend to struggle with paraphrasing the most often, so I'm going to cover this process in some detail. When you paraphrase, you must change both the wording and the sentence structure and then cite it. You must also maintain the content and tone. Don't add your own thought or opinion while paraphrasing. You can add those before or after the paraphrase. And don't change the tone. If, for example, the author is being sarcastic, oh yeah, cutting down the rainforest is a wonderful idea, then you must make that clear in your own writing that when the author said this, they were being sarcastic. The example provided here illustrates a common mistake in many papers. The example I provide below. Notice that the new sentence contains a few new words, but some of the words are the same, and the sentence structure is also the same. Also notice the new sentence does not have in-text citations of any sort. Now, I've heard many individuals say, well, I wrote the whole thing in my own words. That means I don't have to cite it, right? This is absolutely not true, even when you paraphrase appropriately, meaning that you put it in your own words and you change the sentence structure, which requires a great deal of work. You still have to cite it because the idea does not belong to you. Since we're on the discussion of changing words, let's talk about thesaurus-itis. This is a term that many people use. So you'll notice that some of the words I use don't quite make sense. Some of the words I used in this sentence aren't great words. They weren't a great replacement. What I did was I simply went into Word, I went to the thesaurus, and then I picked the first word that popped up, and I made this my new word. The reason I did this was to sort of illustrate thesaurus-itis. Sometimes two words do mean the same thing, but not entirely. So sometimes people use a word that doesn't quite fit in. This is what I would strongly suggest you do. When you use a thesaurus, only use it to recall words you already know. So when I go in and use a thesaurus, it's because I can't remember. So there are 100 words for the word joy, and I know most of those words, but I can't necessarily think of them off the top of my head. So I go into the thesaurus and say, ah, yes, this is another word for joy. If you go into a thesaurus and you see a word and you haven't used it in a sentence before, you don't recognize it, don't use it in your own paper. Now, I encourage you to look it up. I encourage you to go onto Google and see how other people use it in a sentence, but don't use it yourself until you're sure what the word means and how it should be used. Don't get what we call thesaurus-itis. So again, thesaurus is to help you recall words, not to help you learn new words and then insert them into your paper. So, how do I paraphrase appropriately? How do you go about paraphrasing? This is what I do, and this is what I did a lot when I first started. First, I break the sentence into parts, and you kind of break it naturally, break the clauses apart. And then I rewrite each part in my own words. And when I say rewrite it in your own words, I mean change almost every word in the sentence. You really need to. Words you do not have to change are proper names, Empire State Building, specialized terms like diabetes, and those little words that use in a sentence like conjunctions and articles and the but. Things of this nature you do not need to change when you're paraphrasing, but you should change most of the other words. Now, another common mistake that people make is that they don't know what a word means until they stick it into their paraphrase and move on. If you don't know what a word means, you need to look it up. Or if you're not sure what a word, like you have a vague idea but you're not positive, also, again, you need to look it up. Sometimes your professors will say, I want you to write this paper, but when you write it, I'm not going to let you use quotes. I need you to paraphrase everything you read. Every once in a while, your professors will ask you to do this. And the reason they are asking you to do this is because a paraphrase requires understanding of everything. It requires an understanding of the content of the sentence, the tone of the sentence, every vocabulary word in the sentence. So sometimes they'll ask you to do this. So again, if you don't know what a word in a sentence means, don't just stick it in your paper and continue on. Look it up. So after I changed all of the words except for specialized terms and proper names and those little tiny words, I switched around the order of the parts and I put them back together, making appropriate changes as I go. So what do I mean by making appropriate changes? If you look at the 3 sentences I've written above, if I simply switch those 3 bits of the sentence around and then wrote it back out, it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't flow because they don't begin and end properly. So you can change as you go after you reorder the bits of the sentence to make sure it flows properly. So here's my new sentence. I've written this little sentence here. Now, even after all of this work that I've done, I have reworded it. I've changed it around. I've made sure everything is just so. I still have to cite it because the idea does not belong to me. It belongs to Jameson. You can cite in a couple of ways. So I tend to cite like this. I put the author's name at the beginning of the sentence. I kind of work his name into the sentence. Jameson argues that if we operate under the assumption. The other thing you can do is you can say something like, if we operate under the assumption, you can start your sentence there, and then before the period at the end of the sentence, you can put Jameson 2001 in parentheses. This is how a lot of people tend to do it. Like I said, I prefer to work the author's name in because it helps with the flow of the paper. So, also know that you can quote part of a sentence within a paraphrase as long as you set it apart with quotation marks. So there's sometimes a few words in a sentence that you can't say in a better way or that add flavor. I did that here, so I changed all of the words in my paraphrase except that I keep more stringent duties and I put it in quotations. The reason I put it in quotations is because this is exactly the way Jameson said it. So if I were your professor and I were reading this, I would say, they paraphrased everything except for more stringent duties. In this case, this is exactly the way the original author stated this piece of the sentence.